Hi, my name's Jefa Greenaway. I'm an architect. My mob is Wawon, which is northwest New South Wales, and I'm a practicing architect here in Victoria with Greenaway Architects, and so we've been established for close on 22 years now, and we undertake a range of different projects, everything from residential projects, commercial projects, but our specialty really is cultural projects where we start to embed what I call Indigenous placemaking principles into our design considerations. So we're here today at the Koorie Heritage Trust at Federation Square in Melbourne, and this is a project that we focused on a number of years back now, where we actually was deeply embedded in the design considerations and the design strategy of how do we actually showcase a cultural institution in the 21st century, and how do we actually give voice and agency to Indigenous considerations as it relates to the built environment. And we created quite a unique opportunity here in telling some stories and important stories around how we actually connect to country, principally. So interestingly enough, I was involved very early in my career in the competition for Federation Square before it was even built. So I had a real strong understanding and consideration of what this place actually meant. And significantly, the Koorie Heritage Trust building, which we're located in, is actually known as the Yarra building. It wasn't actually part of the original conception of Federation Square. So it was kind of an add-on. It was kind of the sort of ugly duckling, if you will, of Federation Square, because it didn't quite have its own personality or sense of itself. And importantly too, it actually turned its back on a significant element within the geography of Melbourne, being Birrarung, or the River of Mist, the Yarra River as it's better known. And so one of the key drivers to our whole consideration for this particular project was to embed and infuse it with a river narrative which spoke to country. So the design here at the Koorie Heritage Trust embedded a number of key motifs and strategies of how we actually give voice and representation within the built environment. So given it was a fit out of an existing building, we actually undertook a number of different strategies of how we actually did that. So importantly, what we started with as a sort of a blank canvas was very much an institutional environment of white walls and white floors and white ceilings, and it didn't have really much by way of a character to it. So what we sought to do really was to bring colour and texture and materiality, but also a number of different little moments that one experiences through the space as a way of really creating an element of surprise and delight, but also infusing it with a particular personality and character. And so there were a number of different elements that we really brought to the table to start to reinforce and amplify the opportunity here. So one of the signature pieces here was really creating what we call a constructed landscape. And so as we look around here, what we actually see as a backdrop to me here is the showcasing of the vast collection that the Koorie Heritage Trust in fact manages and is the custodians of. So importantly, what we actually wanted to do was to remove some of the walls. So we wanted to break down some of those barriers. And so we actually used the display cabinets which showcase culture as the mechanism to define and divide space, rather than having this sort of compartmentalisation of space. So importantly, what that in fact enabled us to do was to showcase the inner workings of a cultural institution like the Trust, but importantly, behind us what we actually see is the staff. So they are the beating heart of this organisation, but importantly they're enveloped by the collections of which they are the custodians of. So they're reminded each and every day of their important contribution and role in protecting and preserving culture. And as part of that, what we also did, by virtue of this serpentine display cabinet, was start to echo country and echo the elements of the landscape. And so what we importantly also did is we pulled up the white tiles and the banal internal fit out to start to reveal some elements. So what we see down here is a concrete floor, and the concrete floor has been ground back to reveal the aggregate. So what it actually echoes is a sense of Wash River pebbles. And sitting in this sort of constructed landscape of the built form is we see what is akin to the banks of the river. And so we've coloured and provided the textures and the tonal quality as a way of sort of echoing a sense of a landscape. But importantly too, what we've actually done is we've orientated the whole of the scheme to point to Birrung, or the Yarra River, as a way of reminding a connection to country, but also a connection to the layers of history and memory of place. And so sitting within this constructed landscape is this signature piece here. And this is what we call the gathering table. And this is a really important ingredient and element to the whole space that we see here. So importantly, what we wanted really to do was enable people to connect to culture. The drawers are set at different heights to allow kids to access it. We have clear drawers as well, so you can see into the collection. You also have this tactile quality of the edge where you're encouraged to touch and engage with the culture. You can see with this sort of shield type motif into the collection housed within the table itself. We're using river red gum as the actual veneer surface. So again, this element which is echoing a canoe is really talking about culture in many different ways, and really it's important to connect to people and exchange knowledge and have conversations. It's really about connecting culture to people and to really manifest it through tactility and architecture and design as some of the key ingredients which actually brings people together within the forum of this fantastic space. This vast table, which is about 4.5 metres long, it weighs about 2 tonne, but it's a really important ingredient because what it actually does is it brings us from the past to the present and also to the future. And what it actually in fact does is it talks to the history of the trust. So the Koorie Heritage Trust originally was located on King Street. And not only was it on the sort of metaphorical and literal fringes of the CBD, what we really wanted to do was to understand, by bringing it into the Federation Square, the sort of cultural beating heart of Melbourne, was to centre the importance of culture to Melbourne. So within the sort of cultural offerings of Melbourne within the sort of arts precinct here. And so the gathering table actually talks to the original building. So the original building in King Street was actually a 3-storey warehouse. And so in the centre of that building was a large void. And so within that void was this scar tree. And on top of the scar tree was Bunjil the eagle, the creator spirit of Kulin Nation. And the community was very invested and connected to that scar tree as emblemating of a connection to culture. And they wanted to bring that across into the new facility here at Federation Square. But what a lot of people don't realise was that was in fact an artifice. It was a steel armature. It was a casting of a scar tree from the Wimmera River, and it was done in fiberglass and hand painted and wrapped around this steel armature. So the moment we start to disconnect that from its original position within the void of the old Koorie Heritage Trust, it was going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct it. But equally, we didn't have the space. So what I wanted to do as part of one of the design ideas was to embed an opportunity where we talk to that story and carry that through into a contemporary reconstruction of what the scar tree represents. And to me, the scar tree represents a connection to culture, but it also talks to sustainable design practice. So for instance, you don't cut down the tree to remove the bark to make something like a canoe, you only remove that which you need. And so that becomes a really important consideration of how we actually protect culture and how we actually understand the importance of consideration of flora and fauna and also of ecology and sustainability. So these became some of the key drivers to the consideration of what this gathering table in fact represents. And importantly, what we really sought to do here was to move away from the museumisation of culture, where one gets out the white gloves and is disconnected from culture. What we wanted to really demonstrate is Indigenous culture is a lived culture, constantly changing, adapting and evolving. And also what we wanted to do through this gathering table was have a sense of equity of access. So at one end we have a cantilever of about 1.5 metres, which accommodates things like wheelchair access. So there are a number of cultural motifs embedded within the space here. And importantly, one is right here. And what we're actually seeing, and they're dotted through the interior landscape of this particular space. And this is actually echoing what we know as a dendroglyph, which is a carved tree. And so carved trees existed from southern Queensland all through New South Wales into northern Victoria. And what they actually signified was important places. So they might be ceremonial places, corroboree grounds, but they are also markers in the landscape for significant elders' graves, for instance. So they become a really important cultural motif. And so we see here the shield patination, which is very common and redolent of Indigenous culture of the southeast particularly. So what we're wanting really to do here is to embrace and start to talk to the cultural representations as they relate to the southeast of Australia particularly. So we start to move beyond the sort of standard tropes which says the only form of Indigenous art and culture is something like dot paintings, which very much reference the Central Desert. So again, what we're doing is really being culturally responsive through design practice. And importantly, this also marks a connection to my own culture through Walwong Kamilaroi country, where we would indeed use the shield motif. And you'll see this pattern starting to be used in a number of different places within the space, including the bespoke and customised carpet pattern as well. So this really becomes a signifier to how we start to talk to cultural expression manifested through the built environment. What a lot of people don't know, in Victoria there are in fact 38 distinct language groups. So importantly, we spoke to the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation of Languages and we had permission to use this particular map. And what it really starts to talk to is the importance of language. So we know with the diminution of language, we start to dilute a connection to culture. So embracing a sort of a bicultural experiencing and using dual language as part of the execution of the interior design was really important to us. So this as a backdrop to these community spaces that we've created was really important. So what we see here is the greater Kulin Nation. We see its proximity to Woiwurrung, which is where Melbourne is located, but the greater Melbourne region of the Kulin Nation being Tanarong and Djawarong and Watharong and Boonwurrung as well. So what this really is capturing is that essence and importance of the diversity of languages across this state. And importantly, this is a signifier of how we are connected, the interconnectedness of languages. 70% of Kulin Nation languages are in fact shared, and so these become really important. There are a number of really subtle allusions to culture embedded within the experience of the Koorie Heritage Trust, one of which is a decal. And the decal shows the blossom of a manna gum. And for those who are familiar, when we do a welcome for country, we burn the leaves of the manna gum as a welcoming gesture onto country. And so as you move your way up the escalators into the beating heart of this institution, you are subtly being encouraged to connect to culture through a welcoming gesture. So these become really important little moments. While not explicitly called out, they are very much a nuanced experience embedded as part of the project.